Welcome to Echoes of War. In this video, we go back in time to 1775, where we see a young, 23-year-old Washington prevail.
In the summer of 1755, the most formidable military machine on Earth marched straight into the Pennsylvania wilderness. A column of 1,400 British regular troops stretched for miles, dragging heavy siege cannons and supply wagons through old-growth timber, so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. Their target was Fort Duquesne, a strategic French outpost at the forks of the Ohio River. Leading this massive operation was Major General Edward Braddock. He was a veteran of European battlegrounds, a man who had spent 45 years mastering the precise, linear geometry of 18th century warfare. He expected his men to stand shoulder to shoulder in open fields, firing massed volleys on command. Braddock trusted this doctrine absolutely. But weeks before the march even began, Braddock made a severe miscalculation inside a tent at Fort Cumberland. 6 Native American chiefs, including a prominent Delaware leader named Shingus, arrived to negotiate an alliance. They asked a single question: what would happen to their land if the British drove the French out? Braddock told them the English would inherit the territory, adding that no savage would be permitted to keep it. The chiefs left immediately. The French took a completely different approach. Their officers learned the indigenous languages, intermarried, and actively built deep relationships with the regional tribes. By treating the Ottawa, Shawnee, and Delaware as essential military partners, the French secured an immense tactical advantage. By dismissing those 6 chiefs, Braddock isolated his army. He threw away the local scouts and irregular fighters he desperately needed, committing his men to march blind into a landscape the enemy knew intimately. If you look closely at the men trudging through the mud in Braddock's column, you find an extraordinary historical irony. Mixed in among the loyal British regulars are the specific colonials who will eventually dismantle the British Empire. Up near the front, commanding the advanced guard, is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage. 2 decades later, Gage will be the military governor of Massachusetts, who orders the march on Lexington and Concord, sparking the American Revolution. Near the rear, driving a heavy supply wagon, is a 20-year-old frontier teamster named Daniel Morgan. He is currently a civilian contractor, but he will grow up to be a brigadier general in the Continental Army, engineering some of the most sophisticated tactical maneuvers of the coming war. And riding alongside Braddock as an unpaid volunteer aide is a 23-year-old Virginia militia officer. He is violently ill with dysentery, riding on cushions to absorb the shock, but he is obsessively cataloging every flaw. His name is George Washington. Braddock thought he was leading a standard imperial conquest. In reality, he was marching his future opponents into a fatal classroom where they would learn exactly how an invincible European army could be broken. On the afternoon of July 9th, the column splashed across the Monongahela River. Braddock ordered them to cross in full military pageantry, flags flying, drums beating, scarlet coats perfectly aligned. It was a spectacle designed to terrify any French scouts watching from the trees. As the advanced guard moved down a narrow 12-foot wide path into the forest, a French captain bounded out of the trees wearing war paint. The British fired a disciplined volley, killing the French commander in the opening seconds. For a brief moment, it looked like a standard British victory, but the Native American warriors with the French were already moving. This diagram maps out the Native American tactical maneuver. The warriors executed a rapid, lethal geometric envelopment. They slid into the timber on both sides of the road, running silently down the flanks of the British column. Using the ravines and elevated ridges that the British hadn't bothered to scout, they formed a horseshoe shape, surrounding the front and sides of the trapped redcoats. Here is where British doctrine became a death sentence. The regulars did exactly what they were trained to do under fire. They closed ranks. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the middle of the road, they fired massive blind volleys into the leafy canopy, shredding branches. From the high ground, concealed warriors fired individually into the dense mass of soldiers below. The native fighters had a specific priority. They targeted the officers on horseback. By aiming for the men shouting orders and wearing silver gorgets, the warriors systematically dismantled the command structure, killing or wounding 63 of the 86 British officers on the field. The 18th century British regular was a highly effective cog in a collective machine, but he relied entirely on commands to function. When the officers stopped speaking, the machine seized up. Deprived of leadership, the soldiers panicked, paralyzed by invisible fire. The formation completely disintegrated. Advancing and retreating units collided head-on in the narrow road. Wagons jackknifed, horses bolted. Blinded by thick smoke, terrified regulars fired wildly, accidentally shooting their colonial allies in the back. The provincial soldiers from Virginia and the Carolinas understood the terrain. Realizing the danger of standing in the open, they broke formation and ran for the tree line, seeking cover behind logs and stumps so they could fight back on the enemy's terms. Through this total collapse rode George Washington. With Braddock wounded and the other aides dead, the young Virginian was the only man left to carry orders. He galloped continuously across the crossfire for 3 hours. 2 horses were shot out from under him, and 4 musket balls tore clean through his coat, yet he emerged completely unharmed. Down in the supply train, Daniel Morgan was watching this slaughter. He studied how the indigenous warriors moved, how they used elevation, and the horrific cost of standing in tight formations against a concealed enemy. He filed every detail away. General Braddock lay in a cart, his lungs pierced by a musket ball, dying for his absolute conviction in European tactics. Meanwhile, Washington and Morgan were absorbing a brutal, practical education. They were learning the specific mechanics of irregular warfare. What was left of the army staggered through a desperate 50-mile retreat. 4 days later, Braddock finally died. Knowing that pursuing native scouts would dig up the body to desecrate it, Washington made a cold, practical choice. He buried the general directly in the middle of the dirt road and ordered the remaining wagons to roll over the fresh earth, erasing the grave completely. Before he died, Braddock made a gesture that carried immense symbolic weight. He gave Washington his personal pistols and his blood-stained command sash. The failing empire was literally handing its military legacy over to the rising colonial. Washington kept that sash, wearing it into battle for the rest of his life. The news of the slaughter hit the colonies like an earthquake. For generations, colonists had been told that the British regular army was an invincible protector. Now they had documented proof that a smaller, adaptable force could shatter the Crown's best soldiers in a single afternoon. To make sense of the catastrophe, the colonial press and local ministers latched onto Washington's survival. They began preaching a specific theology of providence, the idea that God had deliberately deflected those 4 bullets, preserving the 23-year-old for a grand national purpose that had not yet been revealed. This manufactured myth became one of Washington's most powerful tools. Years later, during the darkest, freezing winters of the Revolutionary War, when the Continental Army was starving and on the verge of mutiny, his presence alone held the ranks together. He was the man the bullets couldn't find. 2 decades after the Monongahela, the American Revolution tested these lessons in real time. Facing the British Empire again, the colonial commanders deliberately refused to fight entirely on European terms. By 1781, that young wagon driver, Daniel Morgan, was commanding troops at the Battle of Cowpens. Using irregular warfare, a calculated use of terrain, and a brilliant feigned retreat, Morgan triggered a massive collapse of the British line. He executed the exact same principles he had watched the Native Americans use against Braddock. That same year, George Washington accepted the surrender of the British Army at Yorktown. He had spent the last 26 years building an army that adapted to the American landscape, an organization resilient enough to absorb severe setbacks without breaking. The news of Yorktown printed across the very colonies that had once cowered behind British protection. The invincible force was defeated, yielding to the former colonial aid. The British Empire sent General Braddock to the Ohio Valley to secure a continent, but by marching absolute certainty into a Pennsylvania forest, they inadvertently educated and forged the exact men who would take that continent away.